At the end of Adventure Time's 9th season, Three Buckets delivers one of the show's most impactful moments, as Fern ends up getting inadvertently shredded during his fight with Finn, which leaves our main character in a complete state of shock that quickly turns into immense guilt. Even if Fern ultimately made the decisions that led to his fate, including more or less or definitely trying to kill Finn, it still makes sense that our protagonist of 9 seasons wouldn't exactly feel great about seemingly ending the life of somebody who's essentially just a less fortunate version of himself. And while previous traumatic events in Finn's life, such as him losing an arm or shattering Finn's sword, weren't actually addressed in the series until a few episodes later, the next episode after Three Buckets, The Wild Hunt, immediately dives into Finn's grief for Fern and regret for his actions that caused his demise, and that's what we're talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through the Season 10 opener, talk about the fantastic atmosphere and choreography of this fairly action-packed 11 minutes, and discuss how the unresolved nature of Finn's PTSD, as depicted in this episode, is one of my favorite looks we ever get into his character.
Death is no laughing matter.
We open to a pair of banana guards discussing the monster they're on the lookout for, while adorably trying to still figure out a way to hold hands. Unfortunately, as depicted through this really fun horror-esque shot through the corridor, the plan does not work out for the co-workers, as their bodies are snatched and replaced by a pool of hot fudge. And this is where we first get a look at the creature that will eventually be dubbed the Grumbo. But for now, he's just a really sick design for a monster. For reasons that I'll get into later, the Grumbo needed to be as simply beastly as possible, and they absolutely nailed it with the Beowulf-esque nature of this creature, which fits the Beowulf-esque nature of the opening of this episode. Speaking of which, eventually the third banana guard snatched stretches into Jake, which launches us into some classic Finn and Jake versus a larger creature shenanigans. Except, unlike Jake in the audience, Finn just isn't into it, and when he gets an opportunity to slay the beast, it becomes pretty evident why. Throughout this episode, whenever Finn is presented with an opportunity to take down the Grumbo, he sees Fern, always begging Finn to spare his life, reminding him that he was Finn's friend, and even more so, he was Finn. Finn's visions of Fern throughout this one obviously don't reflect what actually happened, as Fern wasn't exactly begging for his life in his final moments, but it more so reflects how Finn sees the entirety of their relationship. From the beginning, the idea that Fern and Finn could ever really coexist was pretty in doubt, with Finn feeling like it was always inevitable that he was going to have to eventually take down Fern. And it's this feeling, Finn knowing that Fern never really had a chance, that makes Finn unable to take the life of a monster just like he's done dozens of times throughout the series. In the middle of this moment, we cut back to a flashback that establishes why Finn and Jake were guarding the barracks, as PB and Finn talk about his current rut, which has been going on in the month since Fern's demise. During this conversation, before the absolutely fantastic PB gag, Finn admits to Bonnie that he understands that he was going to have to kill Fern because of the monster he had become, which kind of turns this episode on its head from where it seemed to be going. This isn't a story about Finn realizing that sometimes it's necessary to take a life. This is a story about Finn dealing with having to take the life of somebody he really didn't want to. Back to Adventure Time's retelling of Beowulf, after Finn finishes apologizing to Jake for failing to strike and getting him completely wrecked, Jake spends the rest of the episode, quote, making peace with his aging body. Something that definitely hits a bit differently after Together Again and Fiona and Cake. When Finn catches back up to the Grumbo, he once again sees the illusion of Fern's face begging for mercy, which once again causes him to fail to strike, ultimately nearly getting burned by the beast, if not for the saving arrow of none other than Huntress Wizard herself. And despite what Fiona and Cake will have you believe, seeing HW is actually a pretty big deal for a series in which she's about as prevalent as Wildberry Princess. And I think she does a pretty fantastic fantastic job in being the sidekick to Finn's trauma for the episode in a role that Jake would usually fill. Besides just generally being one of the vibiest characters in the franchise, HW also provides some of the philosophy of this episode in a hilariously Adventure Time-y digestible way, starting with her correcting Finn's statement that she's chasing the Grumbo, as she claims to be hunting it in an attempt to save the local ecosystem. The idea that HW's attempts to end the life of the Grumbo are in an effort to help others comes back in a pretty major way later in the episode. But before then, she drops another line that rings true outside of its original context, as after she reveals that she is the one who named the Grumbo, she gives her reason why.
It's a name that I made up just now, because you can't hunt what you can't name.
Yeah. The idea that identifying your problems is the first step to actually solving them is something that Adventure Time is no stranger to. But I think that this quote is actually to point out that this is not what this episode is going for. Finn knows exactly why he's struggling, and yet he doesn't feel better. Throughout this entire episode, despite having good intentions, any help that HW happens to give Finn emotionally is somewhat accidental, as partially because Finn obviously didn't want to tell her every single detail of the situation, Huntress Wizard clearly doesn't know who exactly Fern is or what exactly happened, describing him as our protagonist but evil, when Finn obviously knows that Fern is just him in an evil situation. When HW and Finn stumble upon the lair of the Grumbo, I think it's really interesting that, despite her knowing that Finn is struggling to deliver final blows, Huntress Wizard in her plan still puts him in that role. Even though she doesn't have a complete grasp of the situation, she still knows that it's something that needs to be addressed. Before getting to the thematic intricacies of the Grumble Rumble, I would be remiss if I didn't mention how sick this entire fight is. Seriously, you just don't see choreography this good in Adventure Time pretty much ever, with some great dynamic shots that make good use of this one's cave setting. While Adventure Time isn't an action cartoon by any stretch, and lacks the truly great fight scenes that other shows like SU would occasionally get, I think the series definitely improved over time, and this season 10 bout is simply one of the best it ever produced. Anyway, back to Finn's PTSD. After HW once again gives Finn an opportunity to strike, an opportunity once again foiled by Fern's sweet face, Huntress Wizard is flung into the wall, as Finn once again sees the repercussions of his grief causing him to be unable to strike. Obviously, Finn isn't exactly thrilled to see his inhibition cause his friends pain, which leads to HW having the idea that ultimately solves Finn's problem in the episode, sorta. Huntress Wizard ultimately decides to give herself up to the Grumbo, forcing Finn to do something in order to save her, an action which he later jokes is a result of his infatuation with her. Finn doesn't just immediately launch in and save her though, as first he has to do arguably the most important part of the episode. The only way he was ever going to be able to take down the Grumbo was to stop projecting Fern onto the beast and instead onto the victim. Besides the ending scene where Gumball sets up the main arc for the 10th season that I'm not going to get into, the bulk of the episode ends with Huntress Wizard and Finn sharing a moment. A moment that, while immensely sweet and fun to watch, as well as showing the true gain and maturity that Finn has made since season 7, also demonstrates a clear lack of him actually processing his emotions surrounding Fern. As a result of this season being Adventure Time's last, and therefore being the most serialized by far, this episode is able to make a choice that they've almost never had the opportunity to do so in the past. The Wild Hunt doesn't give closure on Finn's grief to the audience or to Finn. The immense amount of pain without regret that Finn feels isn't something this episode claims to be able to fix in 11 minutes, as it instead, somewhat similarly to the musical, though, provides Finn with a way to physically get through life while processing what happened. Unlike some of his contemporaries that shall not be named, Adventure Time has never been a cartoon to question the morality of taking a life. And really, Finn never questions that in this one either. Don't get me wrong though, the episode does explore that idea a little bit throughout this one, as the concept of having to kill to protect others is explored in all three of PB wanting the Grumbo dead for the sake of the Banana Guards, HW wanting it dead for the sake of the ecosystem, and Finn ultimately killing it for the sake of the illusion of Fern. Ultimately though, Finn exits this episode in a pretty similar mental state to the one he entered it with, but just with the knowledge that, even if he's still down in the dumps about what he did to Fern, Finn's role as the hero of Ooo requires that he continues down the path of occasionally necessary violence. It's a little bit of a somber tone if you look at it that way, but really, Finn just discovers a way to maneuver his thoughts of Fern's demise so that he is able to continue taking more lives to protect others, in the same way that he took Fern's life to protect both himself as well as protect Fern from the dark path he was heading down. Fern's story, just like Finn dealing with how to balance peace and necessary violence, continues throughout the rest of Season 10, ultimately ending with Fern's actual demise on much better terms in the finale. But even though he's not really in this one, besides a quick glimpse at the very end, I'm not sure another episode in the series gives a better look into what his existence does to the psyche of Finn, as after being forced to take down what is essentially just a different version of him that was put into a rougher situation, he is then forced to live with the guilt of doing it and the knowledge that he never really had a choice. The Wild Hunt is an episode that, right at the end of the series run, feels like the perfect example of Adventure Time's uniquely fantastic blend of deeper topics with fun shenanigans. As in an episode with a few of my favorite jokes on the show, some of the best action of the series, and a great appearance of Huntress Wizard, we still get a deep look into how Fern's apparent death affected Finn, and how he ultimately managed to get back to his life after it, even if he didn't quite get over it. Anyway, that's about it for me. If you want to vote on what Adventure Time episode I cover next, there is hopefully a poll on my community page right now about that exact topic. And if you want to see even more takes on animation that truly make you ponder whether or not I even like cartoons, my Twitter is somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been Apple Samuel, and I'll see you in about a week with another 10 to 14 minute video about an episode of a 10-year-old cartoon. Thanks for watching.